Well, thank you for joining us. Could you tweet the link to the live stream? We'll tweet the link to the live stream shortly. Today we're joined by Lauren Kassell from the Department of History and the Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge, who will be talking about the Casebooks project. Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. My gratitude is to all of the many organisers of this seminar. So we're going to begin in the early 1590s with Simon Forman, who was a man with pretensions of learning and status, and this is when he moved to London and he set out to establish himself as an astrologer-physician. He systematically recorded his consultations in notebooks that we now call casebooks. By 1596, the year for which his first volume survives, he was consulted more than 1,000 times a year, and his success and his methods attracted the attention from the College of Physicians of London, with whom he was in conflict for the rest of his life. In 1599, Forman met Richard Napier, who was a shy clergyman from Buckinghamshire. He was the brother of one Robert Napier, who was a merchant who from time to time had consulted Forman about his ships. So Forman taught Napier his method, and Napier soon set up a thriving practice in a village called Great Linford, which is now on the outskirts of Milton Keynes. Forman's casebooks survived for 6 years, from 1596 to 1603, and they contain 10,000 consultations. Napier's casebooks survived for more than 3 decades, from 1599 to 1634, and they contain roughly 70,000 consultations. Napier followed Forman's system, though with decreasing rigor as the years progressed, and together they and their assistants, there are 20 hands in these records. Together, the astrologers recorded 80,000 consultations, which are now bound in 66 volumes. This is a fabricated image based on the actual spines, because we couldn't get the Bodleian Library, to actually line them up like that. So Forman's and Napier's papers were collected by Elias Ashmole, who was interested in their astrological and antiquarian value. This was in the 1670s, and Ashmole bequeathed them to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. He founded this museum, obviously, and in due course they were moved to the Bodleian Library, where they still are today. So Forman's and Napier's casebooks are, we now know, one of the most extensive surviving sets of private medical records in history. They are difficult, they're rich, they're unusual, and they're also frustrating, incomplete, unrepresentative. So I don't take their significance for granted. We have to start with the question, what is their significance? We might ask the question, I go on about 80,000 consultations. Is this early modern big data? For instance, there are all sorts of questions that we can ask. I will ask some of them in this talk. Now, I have worked on Forman's and Napier's records to some extent, on and off, for 25 years. I didn't discover them. These are the sorts of questions I often get. This is what I call my obnoxious slide, which puts me in a genealogy of very important scholars. I'm not going to talk about all the work that's been done with these records, but I do this because it's both an obnoxious slide and it's a modest slide. There are people who came before me and people who have come after my work. But in 2005, I began work on what we call the Casebooks project. So what is the Casebooks project? So the Casebooks project, and you should, this is part of the lesson, and you should be careful in the name you invent on your first pub meeting. We are the Casebooks project. So the Casebook project is a team of scholars that has spent a decade studying Simon Forman's and Richard Napier's casebooks. None of what I'm saying today would be possible without this team, especially Mike Hawkins, Rob Raleigh, and John Young, who have more or less been with me from the beginning. So the project is the team, not when I secured a pilot grant from the Wellcome Trust, and Ultimately, they have invested almost £2 million in the project. And note that for every successful grant um, itemized here, there are some, there are unsuccessful grants. A lot of work just goes into securing the money, as all of you, I think, know. So our work on Casebooks was completed actually a few weeks ago, and a formal press release will happen when there's a quiet day in the press cycle. We don't know when that's going to be right now, but the project has been live in one form or another since 2012 as a collaborative project which has produced what is best called a digital edition. The grant giving bodies, that's mostly Wellcome, but others as well, and the universities, mostly Cambridge and others as well, have found it a challenge to assess the value of this work and as well as its quality and significance. So credit and evaluation are big issues in the digital humanities, as I think you all know, and that's something that we can talk about in the question session. That's not the kind of mechanics of how you fund this thing and how you describe it is not what I really want to talk about today. What I want to talk about is, it's an attempt to produce a think piece that reflects on the lessons from the Casebooks project for digital humanities and for the history of knowledge. So Casebooks is part of what we now refer to as this field of digital humanities. Digital humanities didn't really exist as we think of it now in 2005 when we started work, right? That tells you how quickly things are changing. And many of the themes that are current many of the themes that we think with in the Casebooks project are also current in this now even newer field called the history of knowledge. So I am trying to work out, I think it's useful to put them together to think about broadening the import of the situation of the Casebooks project in historical practice more general. So historians have become interested in knowledge, in archives, in information, in data, in cases, observations, objectivity, and other things like this, because we seem to be experiencing a knowledge revolution and a concomitant crisis of evidence and long-term thinking. So historians of knowledge often structure their work around keywords and concepts. So for instance, a list might read something like information, expertise, translation, scale, confidence, replication, and pirates. We can talk later about where I got that list, but you might guess from the last word in it. Here is my pompous sounding list for this talk. Right, we have archives, inscription, cases, materiality, visualizations, legibility, and monuments, but I don't really work in kind of big conceptual terms like this. I like to ask messy questions. So here is the messy structure of this talk, and I will go back to this slide as I progress. My questions are the questions are roughly keyed to every one or two of the big words. And there are 7 keywords and 8 questions because nothing is tidy. Unless you begin to worry too much about my skills at time management, the final question, it's going to take me most of the talk to get through number 3. And then the last several will be dealt with quite speedily towards the end. So we begin with archives. What does it mean to make a new archive out of an old archive? This is sort of our tagline, right? When you have to write a web page, and I've written many different front pages for this project, we have this the Casebooks project. The team of scholars, I've already told you that's how we are now defining ourselves, has transformed this paper archive into a digital archive. So what does it mean to make a new archive out of an old archive? What is it that this team of people was doing? So our main output is a digital edition. I'm wondering whether it's the right term, but it's the term we're using now, and we are sort of finished. Everything that we're producing is open access and has been since we started releasing materials in 2012. The edition of Foreman's and Napier's casebooks contains more than 150,000 pages, one for each case or note recorded by the astrologers and for each identified entity. An identified entity is an organization, a person, or a ship. Each of these is identified by the others. Of course, it has more pages because there's a lot going on, but this is one of the ways that we try to describe what's in this edition. The edition includes a custom-built interface for searching and visualizing the data, and I will show this to you in a second. So here is our attempt at listing what the project has produced. So I've just talked to you about the Casebooks digital edition, which is the thing listed at the top. The second item is what we also have on, no, where am I supposed to be? So the second item is the Casebooks critical introduction, which explains, it's as it were, it would be the first volume if we had this were a printed thing. It tells you everything you need to know about the casebook. So it's 150,000 words of explanatory material, all different sorts. Now I'm remembering what my slides are supposed to be doing. So this is what the edition looks like, and there I will take you through it in more detail in a second. This shows you, begins to show you, and I recognize that it's all coming up quite small, but the menus are very rich, and actually not only are the menus very rich when they're dropped down, the pages are much too long because of certain constraints that we had to work with, and because we wanted to actually write down everything that we knew, because now that we have stopped working, we will start to lose, we've been dispensed with. And so memories cannot be relied on anymore. That's the second item on the list. That's the critical introduction. Of course, behind all of this, and then the fourth item on the list is the Cambridge Digital Library, which is where you access the manuscripts. So you can flip through the manuscripts page by page through the Cambridge Digital Library, though we also have all of the images on the main edition website, as well as the fact that you can do some rudimentary searching through the Cambridge Digital Library. And again, we can talk in the discussion why we have these two sites, one that takes a page as the primary unit and the other that takes a case as the primary unit of analysis, and why we couldn't just marry those as a single interface. And of course, I'm missing, I wonder where I lost that. Anyhow, it's slightly sloppy of me. I've lost my ugly, maybe it will come up in a second, GitHub slide. There it is. There's my GitHub slide. Of course, all of this is underpinned by the data. And our data is the most durable thing that we've produced, and we have, as we've gone along, continued to update what's on the GitHub site, and anyone who wants to can download and manipulate the XML as they wish. We've also produced, and that's why my slides are, why this slide exists, we realized that we needed, for various reasons, to produce some a WordPress site where we have some plain English full case transcriptions. What that means will become clear to you in a second. But so this is the informal bit where we have only at the very end of the project said, actually, here are 500 cases that we think are fun to think with, and we're going to give you the full transcription in a really, really easy to use, but it's not tagged the way they are on the main site, though it is all linked into the main site. The WordPress site is down now because this is the newest thing that we have produced, and this is what will be released in a press release when there is a quiet news day sometime in the next few weeks. So that they fall under 20 odd headings, and many of them have been prepared by guest contributors, which is partly how we have wanted to think about the project, because while we've been doing all of this work, we have built our research, particularly in its final stage over the last 4 or 5 years, under what we call an engagement framework. And we did this in order to ensure that the categories and interface that we were working, that we were producing, afforded meaning to as broad a range of readers as possible. So in this model, which we were coached through with our from the grant advisors at the Wellcome Trust, engagement is very much about improving research, not about disseminating it. So we opened ourselves to as broad a range of people as possible. I've always had my students work on the casebooks, and I got a certain perspective from them, but we opened it even further. We did things like make a 90-second animated film. We held therapy sessions or clinics or workshops where we invited people who needed help reading the records. People needed help reading the records a lot, to come and talk with us. And the centerpiece of our engagement framework was a work with a group of artists that culminated in an exhibition in London in spring 2017. And everything about the exhibition, which I won't say more about now, is documented on our website. There's a 9-minute film, there are photographs of the works, and so forth. All of that was, the artists were not illustrating our work, we were interested in the questions they were going to ask us, and then they could produce whatever they wanted. So it was quite wild, but that's how it was, at least the model is, that's how it was fruitful for us. We accepted, there's a still from the rather lovely documentary film about what's in, it's a walking around film of what's in the exhibition. And we accepted an invitation from computer game developers to act as their historical consultants for a game about Simon Foreman and his patients. It's a comedy. It's an astrological comedy, and it is due for release in May. It's being touted as one of the 20 most anticipated independent games of 2019. Fingers crossed it does what it needs to do. But it's only because, I mean, I usually tell people who approach me to do weird things to go away. I work on sex and magic. That's, if I want to get anything done, I tell them to go away. But the way Casebooks works is that my door is open. And if I like the people and I want to think with them, I will think with them. And the game has been a very good example of how that works. We also, in terms of outward-facing things, we went through a phase of tweeting a case a day. That's paused now, but it will resume, keyed to the WordPress site. And so there are about 500 cases there, and so for about a year we will tweet a case or two a day and see what those threads, those very rich but also tantalizingly incomplete narrative threads, what kinds of imaginations those capture. So what we've done in short is produce an edition, an image archive, a data set, a critical introduction, full text transcriptions, and in doing that, we have made this new archive out of an old archive. So by thinking about our work this way, by explaining this old and new, but putting them on equal footing, we make it clear that we do not believe that the original archive is a pristine entity that speaks for itself, nor that our endeavors are simply digitizing that archive. We're not dumping it, we're not dismembering a version of it into the World Wide Web. We are contributing to the long-term history of scribal practices, of which the history of archives, both paper and digital, is part. However, we define inscription and knowledge. Archives, information, data are never wholly raw, but always in various states of cooked. So we're going to return to that raw and cooked metaphor briefly later on. So we now come to question 2, right? This is my map slide, and I warned you it's going to take us a while to work through things. So what are the casebooks? What's in the casebooks? So here is a page of Richard Napier's casebooks. This is also the detail, which is on the upper left-hand side, is inset on one of the postcards that has gone around the room. And for those of you who are watching live, it is this is the case that is the anatomy case page on our website. So this slide is a fixed item on the website. So here is this page quickly anatomized. A single case is inset on the right. It's best understood as containing 4 major classes of information, which are indicated by letters on the far right. A is the question and personal information about the patient. B is a chart of the heavens at the moment at which the question was asked. C is the astrologer's judgment of the case. And D is extra information. So in category A, this case reads, Elizabeth Hartwell of Astwood, once Mrs. Uvedale's servant, 25 years unmarried, hath clumpers of blood in her mouth, 15 September, the symbol for Saturn, meaning Saturday, hour 1:15 p.m., 1599. What that means is that the patient is Elizabeth Hartwell. Her address is Astwood. This is a village about 10 miles from Napier's house. She was formerly a servant to Mrs. Uvedale. That's a relationship. She's 25 years old. Obviously, that's her age. She suffered from blood clots in her mouth, and that's the question topic. It's also repeated in the middle of the astrological chart. Her question was asked on Saturday, 15th September 1599 at 1:15 p.m. Obviously, that's the date and time. So underneath that, in category B, we have an astrological chart which is calculated for the moment at which the question was asked. Hence, the case books are organized chronologically. This is the only order to these records, and it does break down as all order does at some point or another. Below this, we have category C. This is where the astrologers wrote his judgment. That's their word. Here we learn that Elizabeth Hartwell had been in bed for a week with a fever. It was caused by the malign influence of Mars. Those around her suspected that it was a pleurisy, that's a problem with her lungs, a pain in her chest, or an impost, a swelling, and they feared that she would die. At the end of the entry in category, what we label as category D, Richard Napier prescribed 3 sorts of purges and a cooling tincture, and he waived the fee. It says gratis down at the lower right-hand corner. That's the treatment and fee payment. So as I said at the outset, Foreman's and Napier's records contain 80,000 cases like this one. Some of them are with notable people, others with ordinary people who are lost to the historical record as far as we know. Our edition allows readers to make sense of any given case and to understand the series as a whole. This slide shows you how you look at what our interface for the edition as a whole looks like, and the facets down the left-hand side begin to give you a sense of how you dig into the corpus as a whole. This brings us to the question 3, what is a medical record? So why did Foreman and Napier write these records? Why did doctors write things down? What is a casebook? It's all sort of the same question. I realized rather late in the day that I needed to answer these questions. I thought, really cool, I have all these records. I thought that was enough. Never enough. What are they? Are they unique? Are they not unique? So here is a very brief version of my findings. I spent a very long time looking at all other case books that I could find, and I published an article in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine a few years ago. And so here what we're doing is we are talking about inscription and cases, these keywords together. So a casebook is a written collection of casebook. Casebook is a written collection of cases which are typically recorded in a series day by day. Doctors developed this form of writing in Europe in the 1500s. They were borrowing scholarly practices of note-taking and of mercantile habits of account keeping. They were modeling themselves on Hippocrates, the ancient father of medicine, who had reputedly recorded case histories on clay tablets. By writing case books, doctors were building on the work of ancient and medieval physicians whose writings detailed remarkable cures and exceptional cases. They also were like natural historians, borrowing regimes of sustained observation from astronomers. So note-taking followed conventions, but the habits of speech and writing and collecting that produced these documents were very idiosyncratic. So surviving case books take a variety of forms. Some are like account books, written at the time of the encounter. Astrological records typically take this form. What I showed you was very list-like, right? Others are like journal or diary entries, which are written when the doctor returned home at the end of the day. He sits at the desk in his study because he's been out on house calls. Some doctors digested their account books or diaries into observations much later, weeks, months, or even years later. Those are often glossed as case histories, and they will tell the story of somebody's life or illness from the beginning to the end, whereas again we just have a momentary snippet for the most part in the case books. And then when they digested them into observations, what did they do with their case books? They threw them away. So whatever form case books took, they typically included a patient's name, age, complaint, its causes, and a prescription or a payment. We have around 100 examples of surviving case books from around Europe, in European archives of personal papers, dating from the centuries before 1700. Only about 100 examples found so far. They're often catalogued as account books, as diaries, as journals, practice books, collections of cases or observations, or sometimes as case books. The term case book was initially used for legal records in the late 17th century, and then it began to be applied to doctors' notes in the mid-18th century. So I inherited this term, and I use it to refer to the range of records that medical practitioners produced when they recorded their practices. So it's slightly ironic, given that I am absolutely devoted to using actors' categories, that the entire project is labeled with something that the doctors did not themselves use. So case books, in this capacious definition of it, are like other new forms of written documents in this period. They are the product of what has been called the first age of information overload. So with the shift from expensive parchment to affordable paper, and from laborious Gothic to fluid cursive scripts, people wrote more. They developed habits of recording financial, civic, and personal accounts, and new tools to order, navigate, and preserve the resulting mess of paper. Doctors adopted these new paper technologies to account for, reflect on, and study their practices. So my work on casebooks as paper tools sits alongside Gianna Pomata's histories of the epistemic genre of observaciones, and Volker Hess and Andrew Mendelssohn's work on cases and medical records as part of their larger project on how doctors know. Their interests are slanted towards epistemological questions. Mine are slanted towards practical activities. How do we get the case books as we have them? We have those other scholars that I mentioned, Hess, Mendelssohn, and Pomata, and I share a concern for thinking in cases and for written